You join me today in one of the quirkiest Volvos in quite a long time, and it's quite a fancy version of it as well. I am in a 2012 Volvo C30 R-Design Luxe. The C segment has always been filled with an absolute plethora of options, from the dull but worthy to the out and out insane, but every now and then something genuinely interesting comes up, like this. From 2007 to 2012, Volvo built the C30. This thing, it's a little bit different, I kind of like it. Let's take a look around. Now this comes from a time when Volvo was part of the PAG, the Ford Premium Auto Group, and so that means underneath this radically different to anything else skin is a Ford Focus. Not that you would know to look at it in any way, shape or form, because beyond the underpinnings, the very basics of the car, there's not a single component shared, apart from the engine in some of them, but not here. Now the thing that grabs you first of all is the style, always sort of madly wide hips that jut right out, and then the glass house is pushed inside and very angular and square. It's actually based on the 2001 safety concept car, which was inspired by the old 1970s P1800 ES, kind of estate coupe thing, and you can sort of see that influence when you look at it from sort of angles around here and around here particularly. It was revealed at the 2005 Detroit Auto Show, and it had barely changed at all from the concept stage, which is really unusual and a very brave thing, but it's the kind of thing that was happening a little bit back in those early noughties, late 90s days. Designers were having a bit more freedom to do a bit more what they wanted, which is really quite a positive thing in the motor industry. And when it finally arrived in 2007, again, it really hadn't changed much at all. So what you're driving here is basically a concept car. Now the main engine choices with this car were the 1.6 diesel, the 2-litre petrol, and the insane 2.5-litre 5-cylinder shared with the Focus ST. This though is the 1.6 diesel. Early on, Volvo was doing something called the Drive-E or Drive initiative, and they used their own diesel engine, also a 1.6 with stop-start and that kind of stuff, but later on in the production, this car, the D2, shifted over to a Peugeot engine. In many ways this is the pick of the bunch if you want an everyday usable car, because although it's not as powerful as the petrol, it's got loads of torque and gets incredible economy. It makes around 108 horsepower, but also gives 240 newton meters of torque. That means it's good for around 0 to 60 in about 11.3 seconds. Now being an R-Design Luxe, this gets all the performance upgrades and chassis upgrades from the R-Design series, and that includes this strut brace, which stiffens and holds the suspension a bit tighter, stiffens the chassis and the frame, so better for cornering. Now here in the back is another of the P1800 design features, the all-glass tailgate, and this is quite a cool looking thing with the big full-height integrated tail lights both sides. It's even got a little clever wavy heater element to keep your rear screen wiper from gluing to the glass in the cold weather. Now this is a great design feature, but it's also, unfortunately, a bit of an Achilles heel, because it does mean you've got quite a small opening into the boot itself. So your lip is astonishingly high. This is basically waist height, so if you've got anything heavy to try and hoik into the boot, that's going to be quite difficult. And anything wide is also tricky because the boot is wider than the opening, so that's also quite tricky. Positive side, unlike things like the Peugeot 107, that kind of thing, you do have a proper plastic and metal liner behind the glass. It's not just a sheet of glass which is a bit flimsy. This is proper Volvo heaviness. And the seats themselves do fold forward. They're both individual little bucket seats at the back, so you can have a full flattish bench if you fold the front seats forward as well, which I didn't. Now you will notice there's no parcel shelf in this car. That's because the owner was so irritated by it, he threw it away. Because there are two choices. There's like a hard, complete cover with a little kind of flappy thing which gives you just like a letterbox to post items into the boot with, or there's a retractable one which is also very irritating. So there's no real great solution other than get rid of it. In terms of other storage in the back, you've got 4 lash down metal points here at the front and the back of the boot. It's a hard plastic floor which has got space saver spare tire and enough space around here for jump leads, a few various other pockets and things in the back of the car. So you've got not bad storage underneath there for odds and sods, but actual general storage for like shopping and going on holiday, that kind of stuff, is a bit limited. There's no power outlet or side hooks, but there is a little light in the side. Now before we climb in, there's a couple of things worth looking at even as we step into the threshold of the car. First of all, this doorstep, the sill steps up like a big mad kink. It's got SIPs for the side impact protection system stamped in here, so presumably this extra bit of metal is some kind of safety or security thing in the side of the car, so if there's a side impact that may well protect you. I guess that's a good thing. Less good though, or maybe it is good depending on circumstances, there's a little hook down here on the side of the driver's seat and on the passengers, so if there's no one in the back you can hook your seatbelt in there, so as you slide the seat forward it takes the seatbelt with it, which I guess is handy for putting the seatbelt on in the first place, but it does mean anyone trying to climb into the back is going to trip over and land face first in those rather lovely bucket seats in the back. Now climbing in, the interior is utterly fresh and very different from Volvos of the past. Things like this big floating dashboard thing in the centre are really cool and so different. When you put your hand right through them, makes the whole thing feel very light and airy, even in this kind of dark curved aluminium pattern, which is the R Design Luxe option. There were 3 trim levels. There was SE Luxe, which was the comfy one, which got things like rain sensing wipers, power fold mirrors with little puddle lights underneath them. That came with 17-inch wheels called Spartacus, which is good. Then there was the R Design, which was focused more on performance and sportiness, so we got the full body kit, the lower suspension, more buckety seats, a different interior, a different steering wheel, and it came with 17-inch wheels called Kratos. Then finally there was this version, the R Design Luxe, which was kind of the best of both worlds. So you got the comfy things, the comfort accessories like rain sensing wipers, auto lights, the power fold mirrors, but then you also got the performance upgrade. So you got the lower suspension, the stiffened spring, the cross brace between the front struts, and of course you got the nice leather interior seats. This car seems to have absolutely everything on it with the exception of the electric seats and a sunroof. Being Volvo, they were still very firmly focused on safety despite the sporting and modern pretensions of the car. So you've got things like the side impact protection, you've got Bliss, which we'll talk about more on the road. Now from the driver's seat, you've got quite a nice, if slightly compact cabin. The seat itself is semi-buckety, it's got quite wide bolsters, but the leather is quite smooth and soft, which is very nice indeed. Over on the door we've got the same ridged aluminium as we have in the centre console. A plain aluminium was an option, but this was an upgrade option to have this. It looks amazing, but does dent rather easily, so maybe not the best option to have taken for something you're going to grab and keep hold of quite tightly. In the door we've got big speakers, a small pocket with a tiny little cup or bottle holder, a tweeter at the top, and your Bliss warning light. Unlike back in the 70s and 80s when your door handle was recessed down in here for safety, it's now up here out of the way and is a regular, more ordinary little regular sized door handle with obviously central locking in front of it. And down below by the grab handle we've got electric windows left and right, obviously the rear ones don't open at all, and electric mirrors left and right. Interesting to look at this little mirror switch. It is like a development of the old 700s mirror switch, little kind of turret for moving left and right, although now there's only one with left and right buttons rather than a turret for each individual mirror. This car, being an R Design, has got the fantastic blue dials. The speedo on the left going up to 160 with white digits on a dark blue background with orange needles. It looks so cool and exciting. Some real race car stuff. And then the rev counter to the right, heading all the way up to 6,000, where it redlines about 4,500 RPM because it's a diesel. In the bottom of each of those 2 round dials, you've got a small sub dial for fuel and temperature, and a couple of little warning lights hidden in there as well. It's quite small. It looks like a long way away as well, funnily enough. It feels like you're about a metre away from the dials, in fact. Social distancing information readout. In front of that you have your nice big solid steering wheel. It's a very chunky sporty thing. Lots of buttons all over it for the phone, for the radio, for the cruise control, and interestingly the sat-nav buttons are here on the back, which make it kind of awkward to get to. You need to have learnt that, I guess, before you set off. If you want the passenger to set the destination for you, that's a little awkward because they don't want to be really leaning all the way across your steering wheel to do that. So for that, we have a little remote control, which is one way of doing it, I guess. It's quite fun, I suppose. As you start it up, you have the option of easy mode or advanced mode. I mean, I'm not sure what the purpose of that is, but surely everything in the car should be easy all the time. You should never have the complicated option when you're trying not to get lost or concentrate on driving the car. Thanks Volvo, that's not very Volvo at all. Although probably this isn't a Volvo system, we think maybe it is an Alpine unit that's been grafted into the car. The control stalks behind the wheel are massive and slightly weirdly designed. They're big, kind of curved monoliths that kind of crop out from here. Indicators and lights on the left, wipers on the right. They're multifunction with these big extra dials and buttons on them. They are multifunction stalks. The one on the left lets you cycle through the trip computer. The one on the right controls the automatic wipers. And you wouldn't think you need to control automatic wipers because they're automatic, but you do have to activate the function every time you turn the car on. Now this car has keyless entry, so you have a big blocky key which would fit into that slot there if the handbrake wasn't on. So I guess it can go in the door for now. But to start it, nothing so boring as a boring old push button. Now you've got a key to turn, despite the fact you've got keyless entry. So this key remains in the dashboard, and then to press clutch, and the car fires up. So yeah, again, Volvo have taken their own way of doing things uniquely Volvo-ishly. It's an R-Design, so as well as the R-Design dials, we've got the R-Design logo on the steering wheel and on the floor mats, and in the centre we've got a little logo here for the premium sound. It's a 10-speaker system, I think, looking around counting the interior of the car, which sounds amazing. Obviously I can't show you because they copyright the music and they give you a smack wrist if you do that, but take my word for it, it's awesome. The controls for the radio are down here in the floating dashboard thing. So there's volume, tuning, and then mirroring these controls down below are the controls for the fan and the heater. And this whole bank in the middle is very, very densely populated with buttons. Numeric keyboard, which is for the phone, for the radio, then your phone controls here and menu buttons, and then this little nice pictogram of a person to try and find where you want to send the wind, and heated seats, which are multi-twin stage power levels. But it's a slightly confusing mass of buttons. It's a nice bit of visual design because it keeps everything in one place. You've not got buttons scattered all around the dashboard. They're nicely contained, but in terms of actually finding stuff, it's a bit overwhelming. If you kind of glance down at that in the dark for the first time, you might be a little bit lost. This is dual zone auto climate control, but in order to minimize the number of buttons and things you need to look at and have put on the dashboard, they've put the auto button inside the fan speed controller, which is fair enough, that's fairly common. But the left and right temperature control is actually on a push button in the center of the single temperature dial, which I don't think I've ever seen done before. Now behind this big floating area there is a cubby hole which is perfectly shaped for holding your satellite navigation remote control. You've got a 6-speed manual gearbox in front of it, and auto was an option, but I think this car does deserve a manual, being a sporty car as it is. Moving backwards we have more of our little textured aluminium, which sadly is a little bit dented because, as we said before, it's quite soft material, which gives us an on-off button for the bliss, a button which may well have been for the sunroof, which isn't here, and a 12-volt socket for your phone charger. Underneath this big rolling desktop thing, then we've got two cup holders in here. They are multi-level, so the front one is lower than the rear one, but the rear one is quite shallow, so anything taller than an espresso is going to tip over and fill the front one, or your 12-volt socket, with tea or coffee. The front one is a better size, but does kind of get in the way of the gear shift if it's a particularly big cup. Now, T-shelf action, we need to talk about that. The area here isn't too bad. It's a 6.5 because it's quite big, it's fairly flat, but taller cups are just on the curve, so they could wind up in your lap. And this is an important warning at this point. You do not want to put a cup on your sat-nav when it's turned off, because as soon as you turn the ignition on, it will raise up this screen and it'll tip over your cup. Disaster will occur. So be very aware of this. Never use this area in the center as a tea shelf because you'll just be filling the dashboard with coffee. Important consumer advice. Behind that, more usefully, there is a big cubby. It's a double stage one, so you've got a little cubby in the top for small items, and then close it up again. And then a bigger, deeper carpeted cubby hole with a USB socket and an aux input for the radio. And finally in the front, we've got our glove box, which is a huge lid covering a good half of the lower dashboard, but internally only about half the width of the actual outside door, and what looks like a big CD player is in fact the sat-nav DVD, so you're losing even more space to that, so really it's only actually good for probably a couple of gloves. Okay, so first of all, because the seatbelt is attached to the chair, I can't get in, so to unhook it, it's on these little sliding metal things. Again, like a Rover R8. What isn't like a Rover R8 these days? Climb in and roll the seat back, and it's a little bit tight in here, to be perfectly honest. The seat itself is very comfortable. Each one is an individual bucket seat with its own seat belt, and there's a pull-down armrest in the centre, so it's very comfy. And that's actually a velour kind of, it's not velour even, I don't know what it is, it's kind of a rubbery material, which is quite comfy. for an armrest in the centre, big pocket in the top, a lower pocket which is even bigger, and a big loudspeaker in the back. So comfort is relatively well catered for, but the space is not that great. The windows don't open. They are heated so they can defrost and you can see out, but you can't open them. And the belt line is very high indeed. It's actually shoulder level with me, so it could be a little bit claustrophobic in here. Also, the seats are just about okay in terms of knee room. Not luxurious, but I'm not being crushed in. But I really can't move my feet under the chair very much, so it's quite tight around here. It's width-wise though, because it's only a two-seater, both passengers do have plenty of elbow and shoulder room, so you're not squeezed in that way. If you've got a smaller driver in the front, it might be more comfortable. Headroom isn't too bad though, because it's kind of a touring shooting brake kind of style bodywork. The back of the car doesn't tail away too rapidly, so in terms of headroom, you're actually quite well catered for. On the road, you can immediately feel the R-Design hardness of the suspension. It's far firmer than you'd expect from a regular C30. Now, despite only being a 1.6 litre, the tide of torque off this little engine is quite phenomenal. You do really feel like you're riding on a wave of it. And this gearbox is lovely and slick as well. Now, it's worth mentioning, I'm sure you probably have noticed already, this car isn't riding on the standard alloy wheels it came on. This has got larger wheels from a C70, so there may be a little more road noise than you would expect as standard from a unmodified or unchanged C30. The C segment is just absolutely crowded with an awful lot of cars for every different taste. So you have things like the worthy but unexciting Golf, the Focus, which is not premium really at all, but is possibly one of the best drivers' cars in the segment ever. And then you got more kind of flashy things like the Audi A1 and the BMW 1 Series, and then quirky stuff like the Volkswagen Beetle was around at the time, and the Mini, which is obviously still with us as well. So there was a lot of wide variety of competition for this car. And of course, Volvo were always known for safety, reliability not being particularly exciting, and something they really wanted to change was the way people perceived the company. So they wanted to be seen as more design-led, more interesting. And so in 2007 they brought this thing out, and it really was a shock to see a Volvo as different as this. So there was the S40, the C70 all have this same floating dashboard thing going on. But since this car came and went, it was killed off in 2012 because Volvo wanted to take a different direction with things. It didn't quite fit in their model portfolio anymore. But since then, the design direction they've taken is far more interesting, far more youthful, far more design-led than it had been for a long time. And this kind of, intentionally or otherwise, led the way. Now, I'd like to think that, much like Saab, who were handed a Vauxhall and told to go make a 9.3 out of it, and then threw away 70% of the car and made it their own completely, pretty much, to the the annoyance of the executives at GM, Volvo, when they were handed a Focus and told to make a new C-segment car out of it, did much the same thing. Because this feels nothing like a Focus, whereas a Focus feels very light, very agile. This thing feels really heavy and solid. On the road, it feels heavy and solid. When you shut the door, there's a big solid thump. The doors themselves feel, well, even more solid than my 700 series. So I'm going to imagine that beyond the platform, the actual chassis itself and the inner structure, they've just thrown everything else away and just taking big chunks of Swedish steel and nailed it all together very thoroughly indeed. Oh look, there's a 9.5 estate, aero. If there were two criticisms that were going to be levelled at the C30, it was that the interior space wasn't that impressive, particularly in the boot, and the fact that it wasn't as good a driver's car as the Focus that it was based on. But it does feel a far more solid car than the Focus. Oh wow, Sunbeam Tiger, wow, cool. The owner did say that this cup holder very much got in the way, and sitting in the car park you didn't really notice it, but now out on the road, every time you go for second or fourth or sixth in fact, you do kind of find you are banging your hand into the top of your cup. Now, being a Volvo, safety is always an ever-present part of the car. I would have been shocked if this thing didn't get a 5-star NCAP, and of course it did get a 5-star NCAP. There are airbags all over the place. There's protection systems littering the car. We've already seen the SIPs, the side impact protection system, built into the B post and the side of the car. We've got whiplash protection in the head restraints. We've got a thing called BLIS, blind spot warning. So if anything is detected by the car in the car's blind spots, the little orange light comes on. Although I am told by the owner that it's, being an early system, it's not that reliable and gets very easily confused. It kind of doesn't work at all in a lot of conditions and works too much in others. So you have an awful lot of phantom readings going on. As a carryover of the Drive or Drive-E initiative for economy in the earlier versions of this car, you do have the shift warning lights coming up in the dashboard. So if in 5th gear or 4th gear and it wants you to shift up, it will put a little arrow up there just to remind you that you probably ought to be in a higher gear for better economy. Now, honestly, this gearbox really is an absolute pleasure to use. It's so nice and light, and the weighting of it means it just kind of clunks into the neutral position and then falls into the next gear with a nice solid thump. It's a very nice thing to use indeed. Now, despite the fact you've got very, very big, thick A-posts which do come right back towards you, the visibility is still remarkably good. I mean, this is obviously another safety factor. So the windscreen does wrap right out almost above your head, it feels like, and the side windows are huge, and the B-posts are well behind your shoulders, so you've got no blind spots when you're changing lanes or at a junction, which is a great safety thing. Although looking at the back of the car, the rear windows on the sides are little narrow letterboxes, and the rear window itself, the view between the two headrests, is quite restricted. Although because it's only a two-seater, there's no central headrest giving you a blind spot in the middle. It is curious how every time you turn the car on, regardless whether you're using it or not, the sat-nav screen does pop up. And then if you're not using it or hadn't been turned on previously, it will fold down again. It's just a little reminder to let you know it's there. I remember reading at the time, people were suggesting that the 1.6 diesel was actually the car to go for rather than the 2-litre petrol. And looking at the power figures, you would think that was just crazy. That didn't make any sense at all, because on paper, the 2-litre is a far more rewarding drive. It's got more BHP, it's a freer revving engine, but the torque that comes with the diesel just makes it so much fun to drive, so easy. And couple that with the absolutely insane economy. It states 65 to the gallon, but the owner tells me that if you sort of cruise at 60 on the motorway, you'll be doing well over 70 mpg, which is just phenomenal. So on the open road, it is a nice car to drive. The steering wheel is quite light, but there's a feel of weight behind that lightness. It's a really hard thing to put into words, but although the power assistance is driving it well, you do constantly feel there's a mass behind what you're turning. But the ride is just lovely. It soaks up the bumps well, it's constantly comfortable, the seats are really supportive. The engine makes barely any sound at all. And it does feel like if you wanted to hustle it a little bit more, it would be willing to play. Not as willing as a Focus, admittedly. It would still be lots of fun to shuffle around in. There's the thing. If you're willing to sacrifice that tiny weeny bit of driving fun, because how often are you going to be on a back road pushing the car as far as it will go, in order to have something just really interesting and curious, beautifully designed? I mean, this interior is proper Swedish madness at its best, and the exterior is just like nothing else you're going to see either. I have to say, yes, it probably is worth making that tiny sacrifice. And would I have this over an Audi A1? Oh gosh, yes, absolutely. Over a BMW 1 Series even? Yeah, probably I would. It's just a bit more interesting, a bit more quirky. I do really enjoy the big, wide stance of the lower half of the car combined with that narrow glass house. It's an interesting look. So I'm just swinging in to go and change the GoPros, but oh my word, look at this lot. How cool is that? I'll do a lap of the car park just to get a shot of this lot. Okay, we're just about to cross into a national limits section, so let's do a 0 to 60 quick test. Go! There you go, 60. I'll have to time that after the event because I'm not going to stopwatch running at the moment. But I can watch the video back and see how quick it was. And fair enough, it didn't feel quite as blistering as 230 horsepower T5 5-cylinder 2.5 litre, but for a 1.6 diesel that was really quite good. I remember driving these cars when they first came out, doing sort of review features on them for magazines, and always being really impressed at the build quality, feeling just so solid. The drive, which was very, very competent, very comfortable, and just the interior and the exterior, just nice things to look at. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for these cars, so it's quite nice to be in one today, and being in one which is 2012 is the absolute end of the line. This is one of the very last cars they put together, and also R Design Lux, about as luxurious as they came. As I said before, only the sunroof and the electric seats are missing from this particular one. It is a lovely thing to be in. They did a bit of product placement. If you're a fan of Twilight, the vampire versus werewolves thing back in the day, then I think the guy's name was Robert, one of the main sparkly vampire, drove one of these things. Excellent product placement by Ford and Volvo back then. Part of the minimalistic dashboard thing means there's no temperature gauge readout on the dashboard. As you turn the dial, what actually happens is the screen changes from radio readout to temperature readout. Currently it's on dual zone. Hit the button, goes left, goes right, and you can choose which one you want. With the high waistline and the low glass area, you do feel like you're sitting very low inside the car. I imagine part of the thinking behind that is to keep the occupants behind metal rather than glass, because that's stronger, so if there's a side impact you will be more protected by a high-waisted car. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this ride out in the C30 today. It's interesting because it's a car you really don't see very often anymore, considering it only went out of production, well, 8 years ago? Well, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and I'll see you again next time driving something completely different.